Well, YouTube, quite a bit has happened here in the past couple weeks. I haven't really been active on YouTube for a while now. But one incident that I want to comment on, well, not the incident itself, but more so the person who it surrounds, I wanted to get my thoughts and my dialogue out about. And that person is, of course, the late Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher, who departed from this earth on Monday morning. Sorry, I do the accent. But one thing that people have been calling to me and asking quite a bit, friends of mine and people who know me, they've been saying to me, "Hey man, what's your beef with Margaret Thatcher? Why do you have such a problem with her?" And the first response I have to that is, well, I'm Irish, and that's pretty self-explanatory right there. But for those of you who don't know the politics of Margaret Thatcher and what she did when she was in office, it's heinous, it's criminal, it's disgusting. And a lot of this is not known by a lot of people. A lot of people see her as the Iron Lady, you know, um, as this glorified figure of feminism in Europe, which I'm all for feminism, I'm all for women's rights, but at the same time, I'm for fair and equal treatment of human beings, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, religious preference, etc. And under her administration, there were a lot of violations of equality that took place because of her. And I want to walk through this with you, and I want to tell you my personal reasons for disliking her so much, other than the fact that I'm Irish, of course. But I want to tell you what she did that I really find disgusting, and why personally I think the world is a better place without her. So the first reason is, and keep in mind these reasons are in no particular order. I find them all to be equally heinous, and it's hard to rank, what's more heinous on this list than the other. And once you hear them, I hope you can agree with me. But the first reason I'm going to list off here is that she was very close friends with Jimmy Savile, lifelong pals, and he was the Jerry Sandusky of Great Britain. This guy was a sick freaking pederast, and he had no moral scruples about what acts he would do with children, and just how he would manipulate them and destroy them essentially. And Thatcher's government was infested with pedophilia. Savile is only one example of that. This guy was also knighted by the Queen of England, so that kind of shows you the credibility of Queen Elizabeth. I think the monarchy is a joke, if you ask me. I think it all should be done away with. If you're up to me, Buckingham Palace would eject the royal family, remove them of all title and wealth that they have, and turn Buckingham Palace into a giant soup kitchen, homeless shelter. That's my ideal purpose of Buckingham and the royal family. But then again, of course, maybe people from across the pond would disagree with me on that issue. But that's the first main thing. She was close friends with pedophiles, including Savile, and her government was one of the most, pedophile infested governments on this earth in modern times. My second reason is she viewed Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement in general as being terrorist. In fact, she called Mandela a terrorist. And Nelson Mandela, to me, he's always been a symbol of overcoming obstacles, a figure of peace, and a symbol of unity for everybody. Because he certainly is an inspiration. Whenever I've had a hard time in my life, I've always gone back to the life of Nelson Mandela and looked at his life story and said, if that man could make it through what he made it through and the way he made it through, I can do anything. So anybody who labels Mandela as a terrorist, or in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, if you label that a terrorist movement, simply because, well, this applied to Reagan. It was in the Bush. It was the Reagan Bush clan labeled anti-apartheid as terrorists because they received support from the Soviet Union, which is part of the Cold War bullshit factor. But Thatcher called Mandela a terrorist, and Mandela is probably the exact opposite of a terrorist. Like I said, he's a figure of strength, hope, overcoming obstacles, and peace for everybody. And that was just absurd how you can label him as a bad man like that when for everybody I've known has seen him as a figure of great hope and inspiration for all. Um, my third reason is she refused to acknowledge the rightful status that several Irish prisoners deserved, and the status they deserved and were entitled to was the status of being political prisoners. And this led to the infamous, famous hunger strike of 1981. I don't know if you call that famous because nothing really positive came from that except that the only relatively positive aspect of that was that Bobby Sands and several of his counterparts, they showed to the world how brave and tough they really were, and they certainly were tough and brave men. But Margaret Thatcher, pretty much, these guys went on a hunger strike, and I have all the names of the men here, and I'll read them off to you because I think their names should be read off. Pull up my list here. Bobby Sands, Kevin Lynch, Frank Hughes, Kieran Doherty, Raymond McCresh, Tom McElwee, Patsy O'Hara, Michael Devine, Martin Herson, and Joe McConnell. These were all the guys who took part in the 1981 Irish hunger strike so that they could receive their rightful status as Irish political prisoners. And pretty much what they said was, we're going without food, until the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who was, of course, Maggie Thatcher, would grant them the rightful status as political prisoners, which she refused to do. She refused to do. And I have the list here of the time that these men survived without eating food. And it's brutal. But I take my hat off to these men. I salute them for doing what they did. Bobby Sands made it 66 days. Francis Hughes made it 59 days. Raymond McCreish made it 61 days. Patsy O'Hara made it 61 days as well, as did Joe McConnell. Martin Herson made it 44 days. I believe that's it. Kevin Lynch made it 71 days. Kieran Doherty made it 73 days. Thomas McElwee made it 62 days, I believe. And, of course, Michael Devine made it, I believe it says 60 days. Sorry, type's a little small on that. But that's a big reason why. Any individual who will let anybody starve to death is certainly a twisted and inhumane individual. You know, I remember, I wasn't alive at this point, but I remember reading when Cesar Chavez, who was a great figure for in American history and a great advocate for Hispanic Americans and their rights that they deserved at the time, and they still deserve, but at the time they were being denied. He went on a hunger strike, and Bobby Kennedy came in and intervened because he was concerned about the welfare and the health of Cesar Chavez. And if Maggie Thatcher, the fact that she let these men die of starvation is just sick. And like I said, you know, I read off their names and the amount of time they spent without food, and that just to me is a tragedy that she let this happen to those brave men. You know, I don't care what their political ideology was. Nobody deserves to die that way. And all they wanted was their status that they're entitled to as being political prisoners, and she refused to give it to them, and she let them starve to death instead, which to me says a lot about how sick and twisted she was as a person. All right, so my next reason is she was close allies with the oppressive right-wing tyrant Augusto Pinochet, which I know I'm probably not pronouncing his name right, but I don't really give a damn if I do. The guy was a sick fuck. Pardon my language there. But he was. And to me, I don't know how it's possible to be in bed with Pinochet, and while at the same time you're in bed with Pinochet, you're calling Nelson Mandela a terrorist. To me, that's just is a very sick and sociopathic thing to do. And that says a lot about her in general. The fact that she would align herself with a man like Pinochet, who was just a brutal tyrant, but she would call Nelson Mandela a terrorist, as a man who fought for equality and for freedom all around for the South African people. And that right there says a lot about her as a person and her character. My next reason is she helped prop up several brutal dictatorships in South America, and that, of course, applies to the previous. And you know, it just is sick to me how you could stand for freedom and equality, but help aid tyrants and dictatorships in a foreign country, which are slaughtering people by the thousands. So that's my opinion on that. My next reason is of course, the Falklands War, which is a disgusting yet typical example of piggish British imperialism. And imperialism is a plague that affects the entire Earth. It's infected the entire Earth for thousands of years, but in recent times, it's something we should hold world leaders accountable for. Especially something like that. But the previous three, kind of go together in a way because they all promote oppression, they all promote tyranny, and then they all pretty much, well, they all promote oppression and tyranny, but those three, in my opinion, can easily be lumped together. And then my final reason on my list here is how she degraded social workers, and she pretty much labeled them as criminals. Now I know in our society, social workers play a key part. They do. They help people out who don't have a voice. And then the fact that you would label social workers as criminal, to me, that is criminal within itself, because they have a purpose and they have a very important role. And the fact that she would degrade these social workers and label them as criminal is disgusting. I mean, Thatcher in general, she had a natural dislike for the poor and the middle class. She stole the milk from infants. She privatized several corporations and just made them into huge robber barons. And I think a big part of the problems we have within this world, as well as the problems that exist across the pond, are because of her. And I know she was known as the Iron Lady, and people praise her for being a symbol of feminism in the world, and standing and being a woman to succeed in the man's world, and so on. But for somebody to say that, in my opinion, is just like saying, well, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin had abusive childhoods, but they overcame that. Which I'm not praising those guys at all, keep in mind. But that's the same thing. Saying that Thatcher, overcame a lot for a woman, is just like saying Hitler and Stalin overcame a lot for abused children, which is bullshit. So I think, especially that she's dead now, we need to look at the full picture and stop just looking at what we want to see, what we want to remember of her. We got to look at the truth. We got to look at what she did and what she stood for. Like I said, any individual who's in bed with General Pinochet and calls Nelson Mandela a terrorist is a sick individual in my book. And that was Margaret Thatcher. And she will be remembered in my book as being a very twisted person who stood for oppression and tyranny throughout the world. So Margaret Thatcher, wherever you are, I hope you somehow get this. Supporters of Thatcher, I hope you watch this and give me all the hate mail you want for it. I don't care. I'm just voicing my opinion. So, peace out, YouTube.